Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is a video I've wanted to make for a long time. 7 years in fact. Longer than my channel has existed. Now I am finally making this video, but I never recorded footage of either Baldur's Gate or Baldur's Gate Shadows of Arm at the time of playing these games. So this video is going to be rather plain in its presentation, because I do not have the time to play through these games again, even though I would like to do another playthrough. Nevertheless, I do not think any visual cues are necessary for bringing across the points I want to outline, or for expressing my opinion. I've played through the first Baldur's Gate twice, and its expansion, Tales of the Sword Coast, once, although I never finished the ending boss battle with that demon. I have played through Baldur's Gate Shadows of Arm and the Throne of Bhaal once. I finished the first game with its expansion, and started the second the very next day. I have to elaborate now, and say that I've not played the enhanced editions of these games. I played the originals, and I'm only going to be talking about the originals in this essay. Now, I loved the first Baldur's Gate, and I enjoyed its expansion, but I disliked Shadows of Arm, although I did enjoy the Throne of Bhaal. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad I played Shadows of Arm, and I did get enjoyment from it, and I do want to play it again. But when I played through Shadows of Arm for the first time, those many years ago, I found that I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I enjoyed Baldur's Gate. I thought the second was inferior to the first, and I expected that my opinion was the common one. But looking online at the time, I discovered that the majority opinion was Shadows of Arm was an excellent game, and a worthy sequel to, if not better than, the first Baldur's Gate. When I found critics on YouTube had released videos running through the entire series, I expected to hear some of my criticisms expressed, but I did not. So I realised I would need to make my criticisms myself. I know I'm late to the scene, and I know that the vast majority do not care, but on this channel, I make the videos I want to make. So let us continue. Before we do so, I have to explain something very quickly. I am not saying that Baldur's Gate Shadows of Arm is a bad game. I think it's rather good when judged on its own merits, but I have problems due to its status as a sequel to Baldur's Gate. My main contention with Shadows of Arm is that it isn't a good sequel to Baldur's Gate. Let the comparison begin. Number 1. The combat. The first Baldur's Gate was a punishing game at both low and high levels, even on normal difficulty settings, mainly because you start the game at the bottom, and by the game's end you only reach the mid-levels. At level 1, Gibberlings, yes, Gibberlings, were actually dangerous, and at level 3 they could still be dangerous, in large groups. And hobgoblins were rather dangerous as well. Nearly everything in Baldur's Gate was dangerous if it got into close quarters. Weak party members could be killed instantly, and close combat encounters could go either way most of the time. As a result, the player was encouraged by the game to either stock up on lots of very expensive healing potions, or utilise ranged weaponry, sneak attacks, hit and run techniques, and techniques to disperse large groups of foes. Scouting was also encouraged due to the often wide open areas in the game which were filled with enemies. Sending a thief or ranger to sneak through the undergrowth to scout out the enemy's position and to decide on a course of action was essential for an easier victory. I really enjoyed the game for these reasons. In Icewind Dale, a game I had played before and enjoyed immensely, preparation, scouting, and tactical plans were not necessary in around 90% of the battles. Occasionally, the player would stumble into a rather large chamber filled with a big group of enemies and be overwhelmed, but this type of thing could be rectified rather easily by casting protection spells on your party members before charging in. I have many happy memories of casting protective spells on my party members before entering a boss room in Icewind Dale. When I first started Baldur's Gate, I tried playing it the same way I played Icewind Dale, but this didn't work, so I found myself forced to adopt scouting, ranged weaponry, and dispersion tactics to win my battles. This was all very engaging. In the first Baldur's Gate, ranged weapons were very effective and useful. It became a bread and butter strategy for me to have all my heavy characters, the fighters, the clerics, etc., on the front line, forming a shield wall, and all my weak characters, rogues, mages, etc., behind, shooting bullets, arrows, and spells. The fights were often still difficult, but it was enjoyable to play a computer Dungeons & Dragons game, where ranged weapons were effective, and the placement of your party members mattered. In Shadows of Arm, this all changed. I noticed in the first level that arrows and ranged weaponry were less effective than in the first game. For a start, enemies and characters moved far faster, and second, arrows seemed to do less damage, and fighting in close quarters was a far more effective option. So the combat started to resemble Icewind Dale rather than Baldur's Gate. This was disappointing, but it was easy enough for me to readjust my strategies and tactics to play this sequel. But the changes to the combat mechanics were not only limited to nerfing the ranged weapon strategy, but many other things were tinkered with. For starters, the areas in which the battles took place were very rarely wide open spaces, but instead confined dungeons or buildings with many rooms, chambers and corridors. This limited the array of strategies and tactics which were available to me in the last game. I could of course scout ahead with a party member to check the arrangement of the enemy, but there were very few decisions to make after gathering information. You normally could only assault them from the front, and luring away specific members of the enemy group was more difficult due to the confined spaces. But this in itself wasn't too terrible. I was disappointed with the lack of open areas in which to battle, but again I found it easy to adapt. If I knew that the enemies I was about to face were going to be tough, I would cast protective spells on my party members, and then do battle, and this normally worked. What was bad was the great spikes in difficulty. I went on a quest to kill some great evil under a derelict sun temple, only to bump into a dragon. A dragon which I couldn't possibly kill at that level, so I snuck past it instead. I managed to complete the quest regardless, but I was shocked at how early this quest was available, considering that I had no chance of defeating it. Since I've mentioned a dragon, I should probably talk about the monsters in both games. In Baldur's Gate, the most powerful monster in the game was probably the demon at the end of the Durlag's Tower storyline. The most frequent, powerful enemy type in the game had to be the doppelgangers. They were surprisingly tough and dangerous. The most powerful monsters in Shadows of Arm are probably the dragons, and out of the recurring monsters, the vampires are probably the most powerful. The range of monsters in Shadows of Arm is far wider than in Baldur's Gate. This changes the game in several ways. First, it means that the party needs to reach even higher levels to beat the game. By the end of Shadows of Arm, your characters might well reach level 20 or beyond. Second, it means to defeat the tougher enemies you'll need to rely increasingly on spells, rather than on ranged or melee weapons. The enlarged monster pool changes the combat of Shadows of Arm and makes it different from Baldur's Gate as mentioned, in ways both good and bad. It was good because you weren't fighting the same kind of monsters every time. There are so many different things to kill in Shadows of Arm that the game works rather well as a dungeon crawler. However, the variety of monsters creates an interesting problem, a problem I shall expand upon a bit later in this video. Nevertheless, I shall discuss this problem here as it relates to the combat. The much wider variety of monsters creates a sense of separation from the first game. Shadows of Arm is a sequel to Baldur's Gate, but it doesn't feel like one. The range of monster types was disappointingly small in Baldur's Gate. I grew very tired of killing doppelgangers, but it made sense from story and world building perspectives. From the story perspective, the player is just starting out in Baldur's Gate, so the game is supposed to be a relatively small and low-powered adventure, thus it makes sense that you do not kill any dragons. From the world perspective it makes sense as well. The player is not in the uncivilized regions of the world like the spine of the world, where one would expect to encounter the fiercest and most horrifying of monsters. He is in the realm of Baldur's Gate, a civilized portion of the Sword Coast. The region still has its dangers. Nowhere in Faerun is truly safe, but the dangers are what you would expect. Small, not too terrifying, and surprisingly ordinary. As ordinary as it gets in D&D. Presumably, any dragons which lived there were killed by the numerous generations of men who built the city of Baldur's Gate over the centuries. In Shadows of Arm, the city of Athkatla is similar to Baldur's Gate. It's located on the Sword Coast. It is a civilized place, and has towns and villages surrounding it. However, Arm is at least 10 times more dangerous than Baldur's Gate. The typical bandit in Baldur's Gate is a lazy, work-adverse individual who has decided that stealing and killing is easier than a real profession. The typical bandit in Arm, or Athkatla, is the opposite of lazy, and has managed to raise the standards of criminal activity to the point where it might well be a serious profession. Case in point, bandits are relatively easy to kill in Baldur's Gate, but are worthy opponents in Arm. As well, enemies which did not exist in Baldur's Gate make their appearance in Shadows of Arm for the first time, dragons and beholders being the ones which still stick out in my mind. This raises the question of how the humanoid races managed to build the city of Athkatla, where they did without getting exterminated and destroyed by dragons and beholders which are not far away. So from a world-building perspective, this is somewhat questionable. But far more importantly, this increase in the variety of monsters and their frequency helps to detach the first game from the second. The first game's rosters of enemies was too limited and needed expansion in its sequel, but the roster for Shadows of Arm is so large and diverse that it's hard to believe that both games take place in the same world. The difference in monsters between Baldur's Gate and Shadows of Arm is the difference between night and day. A beholder would feel incredibly out of place in Baldur's Gate, not only because of its power levels, but also because of its design and aesthetic. And yet this monster in Shadows of Arm appears in several areas, despite the fact that the game is a sequel to Baldur's Gate. Because of this, Shadows of Arm does not feel like a sequel to Baldur's Gate. Extracting ourselves from this important tangent, however, by far the most annoying addition to the combat resulted in what I named artificial difficulty at the time. My distinction between difficulty, otherwise denoted as ordinary difficulty, and artificial difficulty is thus. Ordinary difficulty is when the player struggles to defeat a foe/foes, even when he has all his skills and powers at disposal. Artificial difficulty is when the player struggles to defeat a foe/foes because some of his skills and powers in his repertoire of actions have been denied. In my opinion, both for someone who has been a player and a dungeon master, players want to fight and do battle with either intelligent or strong foes. They want their characters to do battle with powerful and mighty villains, where both parties use all their might and abilities in attempts to defeat each other. Players never like it when the villains ruin their careful plans or else weaken or cripple the abilities of their characters in a battle. Now, from time to time, a dungeon master can, and maybe should, frustrate his players a little by creating artificial difficulty, such as having a single dungeon where the wizards and sorcerers can't cast spells. But doing this too much will irritate the party and ruin the enjoyment. Shadows of Arm makes use of artificial difficulty far too much in my opinion. Two things kept reoccurring in the game. The spell Remove Magic and Level Drain. Remove Magic is a combat version of Dispel Magic and only affects enemies. It removes all the protective spells they have placed upon themselves. This spell is available to both the player and his enemies. For the player, this is a beautiful spell, because it removes the enemy's protective spells and makes them far easier to kill. However, when the spell is used against your party members, it really is infuriating. Too often I would realise a big fight was around the corner, and tank up my party members with protective spells and effects, only for the enemy mage to cast this spell and remove all the protective spells on my party. And it normally would remove all the protective spells on all my party members, because Remove Magic has an area of effect of 30 feet. I would normally be doing alright with the protective spells on my party members, but as soon as they were removed, I would suffer very quickly. It was frustrating. I felt that the game was punishing me every single time I took the effort to place protective spells on my party members. In the end, I stopped bothering, except for the biggest fights. Now of course, the spell Remove Magic takes 3 turns to cast, so it wasn't as if I didn't have the ability to tell what the enemy spellcasters were doing. And so, I always had the opportunity to kill the enemy mages before they managed to cast Remove Magic. However, I always found it difficult to kill the enemy mages before it was cast, and it was always an annoyance, even when I succeeded in killing them preemptively. However, Level Drain was even more annoying than the spell Remove Magic. In Shadows of Arm, all the vampires had a chance of inflicting Level Drain on your party members with every successful hit. One stack of Level Drain would remove 1 level from the target, and each successive hit had the chance of bringing the character down another level. It was perfectly possible for your character's skills and abilities to be brought down to level 1 if he was fighting a vampire. The effects of Level Drain would last until a lesser or greater restoration spell was cast upon your characters, and restored them to their full levels. Now this by itself would have been annoying enough, but it was truly infuriating, because whenever a vampire or any other creature with the ability to inflict Level Drain attacked your spellcasters, you not only had to cast a restoration spell on them to get them back to their normal levels, you also had to go to their spell slots and reselect the spells because they would be removed from your character's spellbooks when they lost their levels. Your party would then need to rest before your spellcasters could use those spells again. It was maddening to fight a vampire, see your spellcaster get hit, and then have to cast a spell on him, and then reselect his spells. Combine Remove Magic spells and Level Drain in the same battle or encounter, and you have a secure and reliable method to enrage the player. For these reasons, I liked the combat in Baldur's Gate, and disliked the combat in Shadows of Arm. Number 2. Quests and Epic Quests. In Baldur's Gate there was a main story to follow, which was the epic quest of the game. All the other quests were very much side quests. For example, if you happen to hear someone talk about Firewine Bridge, you could go and spend maybe an hour fighting kobolds through the ruins before finding the central chamber, where the full plate mail was located. Again, this would take maybe an hour, although it must be said that to get to a quest location, you would often have to go through one or two areas, walk through them to the other side of a region and continue your journey. You could choose to explore these areas for items and enemies, or you could try to go straight across, either sneaking or killing your way past obstacles and enemies. To complete a quest then would probably take an hour and a half if the travel was included. Not so in Shadows of Arm. Because I came into the game fresh from finishing Baldur's Gate and had imported my fighter cleric, I was expecting a similar questing experience. From the get-go, I noticed something was different. The open world was gone. If I was given a quest at the other end of the world, I could normally fast travel to that location without going to or through any other areas in the world. I didn't like this because I actually enjoyed the travel in the open world of Baldur's Gate. I liked travelling through an area, scouting ahead, finding groups of enemy, caves and items. It was part of the adventure and part of the fun. However, once I arrived at a quest location in Shadows of Arm, I nearly always found myself in something longer and deeper than I expected. The first few quests in the game are quite short and can easily be classified as side quests, but later, all the quests start to turn into what have been called epic quests by some players and critics. I think the term is quite useful, and so shall employ it. An epic quest in this context is technically a side quest, but unlike a typical side quest, it is never short. It is always long. A quest which I thought would take an hour would take 2 or 3 or 5 hours, and sometimes I would need to travel to multiple different locations on the map. While on these adventures, I was never sure whether I was close to finishing the quest or not. Several times I got tired of whatever quest I was on and decided to call it quits and continue with the main story. In short, I disliked the fact that there was no world to explore. I couldn't explore a location unless I was given a quest, which would lead me to that region, and I could immediately teleport to that area without any travelling. I felt something which had given Baldur's Gate a distinctive identity and vibe had been removed. As well, I didn't enjoy the long length of the quests. The main quest is something between 50 to 60 hours long, but if you include the epic side quests and the side quests, then the game can be somewhere between 200 to 300 hours long, according to a BioWare statement at least. I don't know why a game needs to be that long. Number 3. World and setting. I've mentioned how a beholder in the first Baldur's Gate would be completely out of place, not only because it would be too powerful, but also because of aesthetic differences. I think I need to explain what I mean by aesthetic differences in this context. Now, I have to confess that I actually really dislike beholders in Dungeons & Dragons because of their design. They look ridiculous, and I cannot take them seriously. They look like the creation attempt of someone who read too much Lovecraft, but didn't have that author's skill at design. Mind Flayers have a far superior design in my estimation, but regardless of my more subjective objections to the design of the beholder, I still hold that its design would look out of place in the first Baldur's Gate. The main reason being that the monsters and creatures of Baldur's Gate had a grounded feel to them. With the exception of the doppelgangers, everything felt like it could exist. Gnolls and giant spiders don't seem to be biological impossibilities. Even the basilisks with their 8 legs aren't so far-fetched. A floating monster such as a beholder, on the other hand, bizarre and not grounded at all. No pun intended. I just cannot see how a beholder would come to be. The only explanation which makes sense is that the monster comes from another plane or dimension, which I believe is actually the case in the Forgotten Realms. But my point goes beyond the actual physical possibility and probability of the existence of the various monsters. My point expands to the settings of the different games. Both Baldur's Gate and Athkatla are located on the Sword Coast, but the two are very different settings nevertheless. Baldur's Gate is set in a medieval European environment. The architecture, the culture, the clothes, the armour, the politics, and the organisations in the first game resemble that of a medieval European society. This is a world which is rather accessible to the Western player, because although the majority of Westerners are not historians, they often know a few things about that historical period. Athkatla, however, is set in a society which resembles that of a medieval Middle Eastern society. Most notably, the architecture in the game is quite different, and you get to fight genies for the first time in Shadows of Arm. Now, I think an argument can be made that the second game does not resemble medieval Middle Eastern societies to the degree that the first game resembles medieval European societies. Some of the assets from Baldur's Gate are reused in Shadows of Arm, and so the aristocrats in both games look very Western. However, it is clear that Arm is more or less set in a medieval Middle Eastern society. The problem with this is that, as a player who went from one game straight to its sequel, I suffered straight away from settings shock. As soon as I entered the promenade, which is the first area outside of Irenicus' lair, I found I didn't recognise the world. The land was completely different, and the city wasn't like Baldur's Gate at all. The only things familiar to me which were present from the last game were my character, Minsk, Emowyn, and Jaheira, and some of the NPC models and other graphical assets. That was about it, and the whole world felt alien to me. The sense that I was in an alien world was confounded by the already mentioned changes to the gameplay and to the monster roster. The changes to the setting almost convinced me that I was no longer on the Sword Coast, and made me feel like I wasn't playing a sequel to Baldur's Gate. Number 4. The story. Spoilers ahead. The story of Baldur's Gate was excellent and thoroughly enjoyable. The story starts in Candlekeep. The player character is the adopted child of one of the officials of the keep, Gorion. The character knows of his dead mother, but doesn't know who his father is. One day, Gorion takes the player character out of Candlekeep and into the woods on a journey, but they are attacked by a giant man called Sarabok, who demands that Gorion hand over his ward. Gorion refuses, and the player character runs into the middle of the woods, and Sarabok kills Gorion. Thus, a quest of discovery and revenge begins. The player character goes to find his father figure's killer, and to deliver justice. Throughout the course of the game, these details are uncovered, although not in the order in which I am about to relay them. Firstly, before the events of the game took place, the god of murder, Baal, was killed by the rest of the gods. But before he was defeated, he forced himself upon the women of all the races of the Forgotten Realms, so they would give birth to children to carry on his legacy and possibly take his place. These children are referred to as the Baalspawn, and each has the right to try and take his father's empty place in the pantheon of the gods. The player character discovers that he is one of these Baalspawn, as is Sarabok, the man who killed Gorion. Sarabok knows of his lineage and has decided that he wants to be the new Lord of Murder, and so he hatches a plan. Sarabok is the head of the Iron Throne, a mercenary company in Baldur's Gate, and the company has created an iron shortage crisis on the Sword Coast. They have sent agents to contaminate the iron found in the Nashkill mine, which supplies iron to Baldur's Gate. Meanwhile, the Iron Throne has its own iron mine, which they are using to gain immense wealth, as they now have a monopoly on iron across the Sword Coast. Sarabok has also been fueling distrust between the two city-states of Baldur's Gate and Arm, by making each think that the other is responsible for the iron crisis. He later ensures that the Duke of Baldur's Gate is killed, and presents the city with all the Iron Throne has mined, and uses this gift to ensure that he is elected Grand Duke by the other Lords and Dukes. He has a plan in motion, which involves the assassination of the rest of the Lords, leaving him in control, to declare that the rest of the nobility was killed by agents of Arm, allowing him to start a war between Baldur's Gate and Arm, which would result in enough blood and death for him to ascend to godhood and take his father's place. Of course, the part where the rest of the nobility are killed and a war is started never comes to fruition, if the player has anything to say about it. From my short and somewhat abridged recounting of the story, one can tell that this is a game with a well thought out and intricate plot, connected by a long thread of conspiracy, and with multiple branches at work all at once. It could make for a very good novel, and remains one of the best stories found in a D&D computer game. A story such as Baldur's Gate is a very tough act to follow, but I was expecting something just as good, if not better, in Shadows of Arm. I was expecting an intricate and complex story in the same vein. I was very surprised with Shadows of Arm, to say the least. Now, there is not a lot wrong with the story or plot of Shadows of Arm from a logical perspective. The plot is tight, everything logically follows, so it is well written from that standpoint. But in terms of originality, imagination, complexity, and intricacy, it doesn't hold a candle to the last game. In fact, it doesn't even hold a small piece of white material to the last game's story. So let's quickly run through the plot, and then I shall express my thoughts. The player character wakes up in a dungeon where he is being tortured by a creepy Shakespearean actor named Irenicus. While conducting experiments on the saviour of Baldur's Gate and Arm, he keeps mentioning stuff about the player character's potential. Then one of Irenicus's golems sounds the alarm. The underground bunker is being attacked by shadow thieves. He disappears to deal with the intruders, and Emowyn breaks out the player character. Then the pair fight through other escaped creatures and find Minsk, Boo, Jaheira, and a shadow thief called Yoshimo. Upon escaping the dungeon and ascending to the promenade, Irenicus is found killing some shadow thieves with frightening ease. Emowyn decides to blast him with magic, as in this game she is a thief mage rather than just a pure thief. The coward wizards then arrive on the scene to arrest both of them for unsanctioned magic use, and Irenicus decides to come quietly, and Emowyn is taken as well. Both are judged as deviants, and sent to rot in Spellhold. The player character then embarks on numerous quests to acquire passage to the island on which Spellhold is located, so he can rescue Emmerwin. There are actually two groups you can use to reach the island, but the first method, which was visible to me, was to earn 40,000 GP to book a ship with the Shadow Thieves. While the player embarks on quests for gold and adventure, Irenicus takes over Spellhold and restarts his tests on Emmerwin as he waits for the player character to arrive on the island. As the player character goes about getting distracted by investigating the crimes of the serial killer, getting involved in a druid circle conflict, and becoming lord of the castle, he has multiple dreams. In several dreams, Irenicus invokes Nietzsche and Ecclesiastes and philosophizes about death, life, and meaning. He tells the player character about how important power is, and how the player character should accept the gifts offered to him, and how he should be trying to pursue power. When the player character gets to the island, Irenicus captures him and places him in a vat. It is revealed that Irenicus had always planned to be taken to Spellhold, and that Yoshimo was his agent all along, and that he had been experimenting on the player character and Emmerwin to check the power of their souls. He sucks out the player characters and Emmerwin's souls. Emmerwin's soul is given to Irenicus' sister, Bodehe, and the player character's is possessed by Irenicus. Both Irenicus and Bodehe do not have souls because these were stripped from them for their crimes involving the Elven Tree of Life in Sol Dan Nesila. With their souls now taken, Irenicus has no use for the player character or his party and orders that they all be killed. Irenicus and Bodehe then leave the island to execute their plans with their matriarchal allies in the Underdark. The player character and his friends escape, and chase after the two, going through the Underdark and emerging on the mainland again. The party then travels to Sol Dan Nesila, and discovers that Irenicus got there first, and has sealed off the city with magic. What else could he have used? And has connected himself to the Tree of Life, and is sucking out its power to make it his own. The player must go and get some components to get inside. While doing this, he will kill Bodehe, and return Emmerwin's soul. Finally, the party gets inside Sol Dan Nesila, climbs this massive tree, cuts off Irenicus' connection to the overgrown plant, and fights him. When Irenicus is killed, the party gets dragged into the Nine Hells. The player's character's soul wasn't restored to him upon Irenicus' death, so the party have to kill him again, but this time in Hell. As I describe it now, it occurs to me that this part of the story is very heavy metal. Once the player character kills Irenicus, his soul is restored. Then he and his party leave Hell, and Irenicus to burn inside it. Alright, now I've summarised the plot and story, I shall begin with my criticisms, but I need to reiterate something. There is not a lot wrong with the story or plot of Shadows of Arm from a logical perspective. The plot is tight, everything logically follows, so it is well written from that viewpoint, although I could make some reasonable criticisms of Irenicus' plan. If Shadows of Arm was my introduction to the Baldur's Gate games, or it was a standalone game, unconnected with the first Baldur's Gate, I probably wouldn't have many complaints on this front. However, it is a sequel, and because of this, I will, and I did, judge it from that position. My spearhead criticism, the one from which smaller criticisms spring and deeper critique is involved, is that the story of Shadows of Arm is a near-typical supervillain plot with the most generic D&D fantasy elements. Baldur's Gate was a game of political intrigue, deception, twists and turns, plots and conspiracies, interlinked, connected, web-like, and deliciously delightful to unravel, piece together and discover. Revelation after revelation, pieces of a puzzle fitting together. It is a story which took a lot of thought and a lot of planning, and no doubt a lot of time to execute correctly on the part of the writers and developers. Shadows of Arm's story is a near-typical supervillain plot. Irenicus was a power-hungry mage. He tried sapping from the Tree of Life, and his sister helped him in this crime. He wanted to achieve immortality, and become the most powerful mage on the planet. For their crimes, they were both exiled and their souls were removed. Soulless, both characters tried to extend their lifespans, as losing their souls made their lives far shorter. Bodehe turned into a vampire, and it is implied that Irenicus used magic to extend his life. Of course, Irenicus still wanted to become immortal, and a supremely powerful mage, and at some point figured he and his sister needed souls to achieve this end. However, why settle for a normal soul when a soul belonging to a more powerful being, such as a Baalspawn, is available? He kidnaps the player character and Emmerwin for this purpose, to tear out their souls so that he can go back to the Tree of Life and complete his original goal and take vengeance on the elves. It's coherent, but I found the story ever so dull. I thought Irenicus had a greater plan of some sort. It was even hinted that he did, with all his cryptic statements about how the player character should and would accept the gifts offered to him. Yet no gifts were ever offered, and once Irenicus is finished soul-sucking, he asks his sister to dispose of both Emywyn and the player character. The dream sequences in the game were nothing more than character development scenes overflowing with red herrings. The red herrings are the supposed gifts, which Irenicus was going to give or present to the player character. The red herrings aren't bad writing per se, because Irenicus is a villain. Why wouldn't he lie to the people he wants to manipulate? The dreams can easily be explained as some sort of psychological attempt to weaken the player character so the soul extraction process would be easier. They could be examples of more experiments. We know this soulless former tree hugger loves his experiments. Or they could just be simply strange dreams on the part of the player character. However, I felt as if I'd been sold down the river by the writers without a paddle and only a net full of red herrings to console me. I was expecting to meet Irenicus and for him to do one of two things. A. Offer the player character a place in his grand plan to do something cruel but lucrative, not necessarily in economic terms. The gifts would be offers of collaboration and power. B. Attempt to tap into a state of bloodlust or murderous zeal within the player character's psyche, so he could turn the player character into his personal thrall. The gifts would be the untethering of the player character's full power, but at the personal cost of his freedom, meaning the player character would need to struggle to break free and control himself. The dreams had given me the impression that Irenicus had nefarious schemes which would change the equilibrium of Arm and possibly the rest of the Sword Coast, and that these involved the player character in some way. But no, the player character was merely a soul provider, nothing more and nothing less. The simplicity and cliché nature of the story is made worse by the means with which Irenicus plans to reach his goal, the Tree of Life, a giant tree inhabited by elves in the middle of a forest. As soon as I heard about the Tree of Life in the game, I rolled my eyes and realised that Shadows of Arm was an incredibly different game to Baldur's Gate. There are fantasy and D&D generic conventions in the first game, there is no denying this, but that game felt unique and original because the writers made a story which could almost work in a realistic novel set in medieval times. Baldur's Gate never felt that fantastic. It felt very grounded, and didn't use the more obvious fantasy tropes for important plot points. Shadows of Arm, by including a giant tree of life as an important plot device, made the story seem less grounded, less real, and more simplistic. I'll be honest, I had to re-establish my suspension of disbelief, because I lost it at that point. The main plot and story of Shadows of Arm could have easily been written by a below-average dungeon master. Now, a lot of gamers at the time went from playing Baldur's Gate to playing Shadows of Arm, so it isn't as if I'm making any new observations concerning the different story types. However, this game was met with overwhelming praise and economic success. There doesn't appear to have been a great degree of criticism directed towards the plot and story. Indeed, praise was typically directed to the story. Why would this be? I think there are two simple explanations. Number 1, the characterization of the villain. Sarevok isn't on screen much in Baldur's Gate. He is a villain with many minions, and who pulls strings behind the scenes. Thus, his character wasn't developed a great deal, and the development that did happen happened through the medium of diaries and documentaries. Irenicus is the complete opposite. Irenicus doesn't have many minions, he is a one-man army. He is also present throughout the game, in the beginning, the middle, and the end. He is seen in cutscenes, dreams, and in action scenes. The player character interacts with him multiple times in conversation. As a result, the motivations and personality of Irenicus are explored, and as a result he has a much richer character than Sarevok. The player learns that he had his soul removed, and that he is consumed with a single-minded desire for vengeance, but also that he wasn't always like this. Sure, he wanted power and immortality, but he loved an elven woman once. But after his soul was taken, he lost his feelings of love towards her, but he desperately tried to recreate and rekindle these feelings by clinging onto her memory. And when that failed, he tried to recreate these feelings again by fornicating first with vampires and then dryads. But this didn't work, and his imprisoned dryads tell the player that Irenicus is cold and incapable of love. Irenicus is shown to be a narcissist and to have a philosophy of power which can be boiled down to the strong should take power because they can, and because they deserve it. I am strong, therefore. While Irenicus is mostly to blame for what he turned into, the elves who removed his soul really should have considered what such an action might do to a man's character. Irenicus does have legitimate reasons to be angry and to be consumed with rage. Sarevok is a rather straightforward villain, because his only motivation is his desire for power and glory. Irenicus has several motivations what he wants, and the player can understand why he wants what he does. Also, David Warner's voice acting for the character is simply superb, and makes Irenicus come to life. When you have a villain as well written as Irenicus, it makes it easy to overlook the very generic nature of the story. Number 2. The epic side quests. There are many long quests in Shadows of Arm, with their own stories. It is easy to get wrapped up in these separate tales and enjoy them, not only for the action and adventuring aspects, but also for their own stories. I didn't complete a great number of the available quests in Shadows of Arm, but I know many players did, and I can imagine that when the player has experienced a whole plethora of different stories, it might well be easy to overlook any deficiencies in the main story. In fact, I don't have to imagine this. This is exactly what Mass Effect 2 did to me. The character missions in Mass Effect 2 are great fun, but the actual storyline has problems, and most of these stem from the fact it is supposed to be a sequel to Mass Effect. Yet the game doesn't seriously grapple with the threat posed by the Reapers. Nevertheless, this didn't concern me as much as it should have, because I was too busy enjoying the character missions. I shall say this before departing from this section of the video. The story of Shadows of Arm is enjoyable when approached correctly. The problem was, I was coming straight off the bat from playing Baldur's Gate, and so I was prompted to approach the story with expectations informed by the previous game. I was expecting another web-like plot with conspiracies and political shenanigans. I expected an in-depth story, but instead I found myself in a rather underwhelming plot. Number 5. Miniature/franchise genres and concluding remarks. After hearing my complaints about how Shadows of Arm does not have a plot similar in depth and style to Baldur's Gate, nor the same type of combat, one might be disposed to say that I never should have had such expectations. Shadows of Arm, after all, is supposed to be a sequel to Baldur's Gate, not a copycat or rehash of what came before. I'm more than happy to agree that a rehash should not have been expected or demanded, and I wasn't hoping for a duplicate of the previous game with a new coat of paint. A sequel needs to distinguish itself from its predecessor enough so that the experience is different, but it also needs to have a certain level of familiarity so that the player, consumer, or audience member knows that he is seeing an extension of the original work. This is pivotal. Whenever a gamer picks up a sequel to a computer game he has enjoyed, he wants the new edition to be an improvement on the last one, especially in terms of gameplay, graphics, and environments. He also wants new things to enjoy, such as novel weapons, stories, and locations. But he wants the familiar as well. He doesn't want a completely different game. If he wanted such a thing, he would buy a different game. He wants those elements which defined the last game to be present in this one, overhauled and updated perhaps, but he wants their presence. In short, he wants the two games to form their own miniature genre, with their own miniature tropes and conventions which link them together. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to present an example of a miniature genre, which I am also going to call a franchise genre, for reasons which will soon become apparent. The Elder Scrolls games. Since the beginning, The Elder Scrolls has been an open-world, role-playing fantasy series set in the fictional continent of Tamriel. Open-world and role-playing elements are present in all the games, along with the geographical regions of Tamriel, and because of this, The Elder Scrolls is a miniature genre or franchise genre of its own. The series has its own signature tropes, elements, and conventions which distinguish it from other fantasy games, while also providing it with an identity that unites all the fantasy games made by Bethesda Softworks within the franchise. Can you imagine Bethesda Softworks announcing a new Elder Scrolls game which was not set in Tamriel or didn't have an open world? Todd Howard may be a great meme generator in his own right, but he isn't the fool some people like to depict him as. He would never sign off on an Elder Scrolls game which wasn't open world and not set in Tamriel, because while such a game would bear the label of Elder Scrolls, it would not be part of the established Elder Scrolls miniature genre of fantasy computer games, because it would not contain any of those signature elements. But going back to Baldur's Gate and Shadows of Arm, this is where the points I made on the gameplay and the story of Shadows of Arm converge. There are several elements which gave Baldur's Gate its personality and feel. First, the open world. Second, the combat mechanics, and all the tactics and strategies resulting from them. Third, a complex story. Baldur's Gate had an intricately webbed story with political, mercantile, and religious threads which all came together. Fourth, Baldur's Gate itself. the city of Baldur's Gate and the surrounding regions were fundamental to the game and its appeal. These 4 things made the game unique and separated it, in my mind, from games such as Icewind Dale, which has different combat, along with different tactics and strategies, and a rather typical D&D story. However, these 4 elements were radically different in Shadows of Arm. First, the open world was removed. The city remained an open world, but outside the city you could only visit a few areas. Second, the combat changed, and so did all the tactics and strategies associated with it. Third, the story was simple. Shadows of Arm's story was nowhere near as unique and original as the one in Baldur's Gate. The story was typical D&D fare. Fourth, the world was completely different. While Shadows of Arm does take place on the Sword Coast, the city, the surrounding regions, and the monsters are different in design, and there is very little connection to the world of the former game. The story events do not involve the city of Baldur's Gate at all. For a game called Baldur's Gate Shadows of Arm, Baldur's Gate is strangely absent. Now, of course, other elements from the first Baldur's Gate game are present in Shadows of Arm. Characters such as Minsk, Boo, Vikonica, Jaheira, and the player character, if you decided to import him from the first game, which I did, are in the game. However, while it may be safe to say the characters in Shadows of Arm define the game in many ways, I think it is also safe to say that the characters in the first Baldur's Gate don't define it to the same extent, so the inclusion of these characters in the second game isn't as important for franchise continuity as one might think. It would have been disappointing to play Shadows of Arm and not see any of the characters from Baldur's Gate, but I don't think it would have hurt the game a great deal. To provide a contrast, imagine playing the Mass Effect trilogy for the first time, then starting Mass Effect 2, only to find that while you still had the Normandy, Garrus, Tali, Joker, Liara, Anderson, and Udina were not in the game. While the Normandy would have provided a small sense of continuity, the larger sense of continuity would have been destroyed completely, because the characters in the first game were one of the features which define Mass Effect. The Normandy, while good and fun, didn't define Mass Effect to the same extent. What I'm trying to argue is the first 4 elements were what made Baldur's Gate, and I was under the impression that these 4 things would be the foundational conventions to establishing the mini-genre of the Baldur's Gate series. So when I started Shadows of Arm and realised that these elements were effectively absent, I didn't feel like I was playing a sequel. Instead, Shadows of Arm felt like a standalone title, and this disappointed me because I wanted to play a sequel. At this point, it almost goes without saying, but I very much enjoyed the expansion The Throne of Baal, because it did feel like a sequel to Baldur's Gate, because it finally gave a conclusion to the fight for Baal's empty throne. The Throne of Baal continued the Baal storyline. It may have not had the locations of Baldur's Gate or the open world or the same combat mechanics, but it did connect with the story of the first game. Ironically, in Shadows of Arm, although there is some fuss made over the player character's lineage to Baal, after all, Irenicus wants the player character's soul, specifically because it is a powerful one, the story could have worked without any reference to Baal. It could be explained that the player character and Emmeline had really strong souls, because they belonged to powerful adventurers or whatever, and that this is what attracted Irenicus's eye. The lineage of Baal was not necessary for the plot, unlike in the first game, where a bloodline to Baal was needed both for multiple plot points to make sense, and for there to be personal stakes, among other things. Shadows of Arm feels completely disconnected from Baldur's Gate, because it doesn't incorporate the foundational characteristics of the first game into its design. Instead, it ejected all of them. As a result, it just doesn't feel like a sequel to Baldur's Gate. It feels like a fan game, made by another company. An impressive, massive, and epic fan game. A game worthy of praise. There is no denying that Shadows of Arm was and is a game of many epic quests, interesting characters, and fun combat. But it is hard to call it a sequel to Baldur's Gate. In short, I think Shadows of Arm is a good game, but is a poor sequel. I think I would have enjoyed it a lot more if someone had told me before playing it that it wasn't a sequel to Baldur's Gate, and to play the game without any expectations of it being one. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day. A funny thing about importing a character from Baldur's Gate to Shadows of Arm. In Baldur's Gate, I made a fighter cleric, and chose this voice for him.
Time for a bit of the rough and tumble.
However, in Shadows of Arm, while I could choose the same portrait, this voice set was not available, so I chose this one to replace it.
By my honor, you shall not see another day!
I figured that Irenicus's torture and experiments had changed my character's personality and outlook on life forever, and given him a sense of honor.